A racist gang's brutal ambush on a black judge spirals out of control. But it's the judge's response that sends shockwaves across the country. This story takes a turn you'll never see coming. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting an eerie golden glow over the quiet streets of Millhaven, a small, seemingly peaceful town in the deep south. Judge Elijah Carter, one of the few black judges in the state, had spent the day in court deliberating a case that had drawn significant public attention. Known for his unwavering integrity and refusal to bend under pressure, Elijah had made both allies and enemies during his tenure on the bench. As he locked the doors to his office and stepped into the evening air, a chilling sensation crept up his spine. He was used to the occasional tense glance or veiled threat from individuals unhappy with his rulings, but tonight felt different. The streets seemed too quiet. The sound of gravel crunching under his shoes echoed through the empty parking lot. Elijah reached his car, a modest black sedan, and was about to unlock it when a guttural voice broke the silence. "Well, if it ain't the Honorable Judge Carter," the voice sneered, dripping with venom. Elijah turned, his chest tightening. 5 men emerged from the shadows, their faces obscured by hoods, but their intentions unmistakable. The leader, a wiry man with a deep scar across his cheek, stepped forward, twirling a rusted chain in his hand. "You think you can take away what's ours?" The leader spat, his words heavy with hate. Elijah's heart pounded as he stood his ground, his dark brown eyes locking with the leader's cold, steely gaze. "Justice is for everyone," Elijah replied, his voice calm but firm. "I don't take sides. I follow the law." The leader laughed, a sinister sound that sent shivers down Elijah's spine. "Law? Your kind don't get to tell us what's fair." Before Elijah could respond, one of the men lunged forward, shoving him hard against his car. The metallic thud of his back hitting the door rang out into the night. Elijah winced, but refused to show fear. He knew that any sign of weakness would only embolden them. The men closed in, their intentions clear. They hurled racial slurs, each word cutting like a knife. One of them swung a bat, shattering the side mirror of Elijah's car. Another dragged the tip of a switchblade across the hood, leaving a jagged scratch. Elijah's mind raced. He knew he couldn't physically overpower them, but he also wouldn't beg for mercy. As the leader raised his chain, poised to strike, Elijah's deep, resonant voice cut through the chaos. "You can break my car, my body, even my spirit," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "But you will never break the truth. And the truth is your hatred doesn't make you strong, it makes you small." For a fleeting moment, the leader hesitated, his grip on the chain loosening. But the pause was brief, and with a roar of rage, he swung. Elijah braced himself, the cold metal grazing his arm before the sound of distant sirens pierced the air. The gang froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the wailing noise. Someone must have seen the commotion and called for help. "Let's go!" the leader barked, dropping the chain. The men scattered like shadows retreating from the light, disappearing into the night as the flashing red and blue lights grew closer. Elijah stood in the parking lot, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to wear off. His car was wrecked, his arm throbbed with pain, but he was alive. The officers who arrived moments later were visibly shaken as they surveyed the damage and took Elijah's statement. "You're lucky they didn't do worse," one officer said, his voice trembling. Elijah looked at the shattered glass and the jagged scratch on his car. "Luck has nothing to do with it," he replied. "It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost." As the officers worked, Elijah leaned against his damaged car, staring at the fading horizon. He knew this attack was just the beginning, a warning meant to intimidate him into silence. But he also knew something else. He wasn't going to back down. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, who had ever been made to feel small because of the color of their skin. Elijah Carter had faced hate before, but this time he was determined to respond in a way that would not only shock his attackers, but inspire a nation. The next morning, Elijah Carter stood in front of his bathroom mirror, studying the faint bruise forming on his forearm. His reflection was calm, But the events of the previous night replayed in his mind like a haunting film reel. Each hateful word, each violent action, reminded him of the long road still ahead in his fight for justice. Despite the pain, Elijah dressed with purpose. His crisp black suit and a tie, bright red, symbolizing resilience, spoke volumes. As he adjusted his tie, his phone buzzed incessantly on the counter. The story had spread faster than he could have anticipated. By dawn, photos of his vandalized car and snippets of police reports had surfaced on social media. The headline on one prominent news site read, "Black judge targeted in apparent hate crime, justice under siege." He sighed deeply as he scrolled through the comments. Most were supportive, expressing outrage and offering words of encouragement, but the hateful remarks still seeped through. They always did. Serves him right. Should have stayed in his place. Justice? Elijah set the phone down and closed his eyes, focusing on the voices that mattered, the ones urging him to keep going. Today wasn't just another day in court. It was a pivotal moment. When Elijah arrived at the courthouse, the scene outside was unlike anything he had experienced before. A large crowd had gathered, their chants echoing through the air. Signs reading "Justice for all" and "Hate has no place here" were held high. Reporters jostled for position, their microphones poised to catch every word. As he stepped out of his car, the crowd erupted in cheers. It was a stark contrast to the chilling silence of the ambush the night before. Elijah felt a lump form in his throat as he approached the courthouse steps. One voice cut through the noise. "Judge Carter!" shouted a young woman from the crowd. She held a small child in her arms, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for standing up for us. We're with you." Elijah paused, his gaze meeting hers. He nodded, his voice steady. "Thank you. This fight isn't just mine, it's ours." Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. The courtroom was packed with supporters, attorneys, and local activists who had come to witness the day's proceedings. The case before him was a contentious one, involving a black small business owner accused of stealing from a white-owned store. The evidence was shaky at best, but the local media had painted the man as guilty from the start. Elijah took his seat at the bench, his expression unreadable. The events of the previous night had not shaken his commitment to impartiality, but they had strengthened his resolve to ensure that justice was truly served. As the trial began, Elijah's mind occasionally drifted. He thought of the men who had attacked him and wondered what kind of hatred could drive someone to such violence. More importantly, he thought about the broader system that allowed such hate to thrive. By midday, Elijah called for a recess, retreating to his chambers. His assistant, Maya, a young law graduate with a fiery passion for equality, followed him in. "Judge Carter," she began, her voice tight with concern. "The media is everywhere. They want a statement about last night. Are you sure you want to stay silent on this?" Elijah leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "What would a statement accomplish, Maya? Words are cheap. Actions matter. But people need to hear from you," Maya pressed. "They need to see that you're not afraid, that you won't be silenced." Elijah looked out the window at the crowd still gathered outside, their chants faintly audible even through the thick glass. "I'm not afraid," he said quietly. "But I need to make sure that when I do speak, it's not just for me. It's for something bigger." That afternoon, Elijah returned to the courtroom, delivering a ruling that was both fair and firm. The accused small business owner was acquitted due to insufficient evidence, and Elijah used the moment to address the deeper issues at play. "Justice is blind, or so they say," Elijah began, his voice ringing clear and strong. "But too often, prejudice clouds our vision. My duty as a judge is not just to interpret the law, but to uphold the principles of fairness and equality. Let this courtroom be a reminder that justice serves everyone, not just the privileged few." The courtroom fell silent, his words hanging in the air. Outside, the crowd erupted in applause as news of the verdict spread. But Elijah wasn't done. That evening he issued a public statement, standing before a sea of cameras and microphones outside the courthouse. "What happened to me last night was not just an attack on a man. It was an attack on justice," he began, his tone unwavering. "But let me be clear, I will not be intimidated. I will not be silenced. Hate may try to destroy us, but it only makes our resolve stronger. The broadcast aired across the nation, sparking a wave of reactions. Social media lit up with hashtags like Stand with Judge Carter and Justice for All. Prominent figures in law, politics, and entertainment voiced their support, condemning the actions of the gang and calling for a broader conversation about systemic racism. Meanwhile, in a darkened room miles away, the gang that had attacked Elijah watched the broadcast, their faces contorted in frustration and disbelief. They had sought to break him, but instead, they had amplified his voice. Elijah Carter's words weren't just a response. They were a rallying cry. And the nation was listening. The days following Elijah's public statement were a whirlwind. News outlets replayed his speech on a loop, and communities across the country rallied around his message. Vigils were held, letters poured in, and schools held assemblies to discuss the broader issues of racism and justice. Elijah's steadfast resolve had sparked a movement larger than he ever could have imagined. At his home, Elijah tried to find solace in the mundane, watering his plants, reading case briefs, and listening to jazz. But his phone never stopped buzzing. Messages of support arrived by the hundreds, but so did the darker ones. Threats from anonymous sources seeped into his inbox like poison, each one laced with malice. I'll make sure you don't see another sunrise. You're a disgrace to the bench. Watch your back. This isn't over. Elijah stared at his screen, his hands gripping the phone tightly. He felt a mix of anger and sadness, but refused to let the fear paralyze him. He'd seen too much in his life to let hate dictate his actions. Instead, he forwarded the messages to law enforcement, adding them to the growing pile of evidence against the group that had attacked him. At the same time, Elijah's attackers were facing mounting pressure. Local law enforcement had identified several suspects using surveillance footage from nearby businesses and witness testimonies. The leader of the gang, Ryan "Scar" Fulton, had gone into hiding, but his name was plastered across headlines. The nation wasn't just watching, it was demanding action. Protesters marched in the streets chanting, "No justice, no peace," and carrying signs with Elijah's face alongside messages like, "Courage in the face of hate." But amidst the chaos, Elijah found moments of profound connection. One evening, as he stepped out of the courthouse, he was approached by a young man no older than 20. "Judge Carter," the young man began, his voice trembling. Elijah paused, his expression softening. "Yes." The young man hesitated before pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. I wrote this for you," he said, handing it over. Elijah unfolded the note. It was a poem, handwritten and raw, but deeply moving. The final lines read, "You stood, though the world pushed back. You spoke, though the hate screamed louder. You inspire us all to rise, to fight, to hope." Elijah felt his throat tighten as he looked at the young man. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "What's your name?" "Marcus," the young man replied. "I just wanted to say, because of you, I'm not afraid anymore." Elijah placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You have more strength than you know, Marcus. Never let anyone take that from you." The encounter reaffirmed why Elijah had chosen this path. It wasn't about the titles or the recognition. It was about planting seeds of hope in others, showing them that they too could stand against injustice. Meanwhile, the investigation into the attack continued to intensify. Law enforcement officers worked tirelessly to track down the gang, using every resource at their disposal. It wasn't just about holding them accountable for attacking Elijah. It was about dismantling the network of hate they represented. One evening, Elijah received a call from Detective Marissa Hayes, the lead investigator on the case. "Judge Carter," she began, "we've made progress. We have 3 of the suspects in custody, and we're closing in on Fulton." Elijah exhaled deeply. "That's good to hear, Detective." "Thank you." Marissa hesitated. "There's something else you should know. During questioning, one of the men said something troubling. What is it?" Elijah asked, his voice steady. "They claim the attack wasn't random. They were targeting you specifically because of a ruling you made last year." Elijah's mind raced as he pieced together the timeline. The ruling she referred to had involved a high-profile case where he had sentenced a member of a white supremacist group to a lengthy prison term. It was a case that had garnered widespread attention and vitriol from extremist circles. "I see," Elijah said after a moment. "Thank you for letting me know. Please keep me updated." As the call ended, Elijah sat in silence, the weight of the revelation settling over him. This attack wasn't just a hate crime, it was retaliation. He had become a symbol of resistance against a toxic ideology, and they had sought to silence him. But they had failed. Elijah's determination only grew stronger. He knew the risks he faced, but he also knew he wasn't alone. The community stood with him, as did people across the nation. And now, with law enforcement closing in on the perpetrators, he saw a glimmer of justice on the horizon. As the days turned into weeks, Elijah continued his work on the bench, each ruling underscoring his commitment to fairness and equality. But behind the scenes, he was preparing for something bigger, a public forum where he would address not just his own experience, but the systemic issues that had allowed hate to thrive. This wasn't just about justice for himself, it was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he had. Elijah Carter was more than a judge now. He was a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage could light the way. The day of the public forum arrived, and Elijah stood backstage in the packed auditorium, his heart pounding. This wasn't a courtroom where he controlled the flow of dialogue. It was an open platform, raw and unfiltered. The crowd was electric. Community members, activists, reporters, and even families who had traveled from across the country to hear him speak. Elijah took a deep breath, grounding himself in the thought that this wasn't about him. It was about the fight for justice and the countless others who had endured similar attacks. As he stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent, the weight of anticipation hanging heavy in the air. "Good evening," he began, his voice strong yet tinged with emotion. "I stand before you not just as a judge, but as a man who has seen the worst of humanity. And the best." He paused, scanning the crowd. "A few weeks ago I was attacked. Not for something I did, but for something I represent. To those men, I wasn't a person. I was a target, a symbol of change they couldn't accept." A murmur rippled through the audience, the tension palpable. Elijah continued, his voice rising with conviction. "But here's the truth they failed to understand. Every act of hate is an opportunity for courage. Every attempt to silence is a chance to speak louder. And every moment of darkness can be met with light." The audience erupted into applause, but Elijah raised a hand to quiet them. "This isn't just my story," he said. "It's the story of every person who has ever been told they don't belong, of every community that has been told to stay silent. But let me be clear, we will not be silent. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." As he spoke, a montage of images played on the large screen behind him. Photos of marches, letters of support, and clips of communities coming together in solidarity. Each image was a testament to the power of unity. "I'm not here to seek vengeance," Elijah said, his tone softening. "I'm here to seek justice. And justice doesn't mean simply punishing those who attacked me. It means addressing the system that allowed their hatred to flourish." He took a deep breath, the words he had rehearsed for days now pouring out naturally. "We must ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to leave for the next generation? Do we want a world where fear and division dictate our lives? Or do we want a world where every person, regardless of the color of their skin, their faith or their background, can walk freely without fear?" The room was silent, every ear attuned to his words. Elijah felt the weight of the moment, but pushed forward. "Change doesn't start in courtrooms or government halls. It starts here," he said, placing a hand over his heart. "With each of us choosing courage over complacency, love over hate, and action over silence." The crowd rose to their feet, their applause thunderous. Elijah stepped back, the roar of support washing over him like a tidal wave. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of hope, not just for himself, but for the nation. In the days following the forum, the investigation into the gang responsible for Elijah's attack reached a pivotal moment. Ryan "Scar" Fulton, the gang's leader, had been captured after a high-speed chase through rural Alabama. The arrest was met with cheers from activists and community leaders who saw it as a step toward justice. When the case went to trial, Elijah was called to testify. As he took the stand, he felt the eyes of the courtroom on him, including those of the man who had led the attack. Fulton's expression was defiant, but Elijah met his gaze without flinching. "Do you recognize the man who attacked you?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes," Elijah replied, his voice steady. "It was him." The courtroom was silent as the prosecutor continued questioning. Elijah recounted the events of that night with clarity, each word carrying the weight of truth. When the defense attempted to paint the attack as a misunderstanding, Elijah's calm rebuttals dismantled their arguments piece by piece. The trial lasted 2 weeks, with witness testimonies, video evidence, and forensic reports painting a clear picture of the gang's intent. In the end, the jury deliberated for just 4 hours before delivering their verdict. Guilty on all counts, Fulton and his accomplices were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, their actions condemned not just by the court, but by a nation that had rallied around Elijah. After the trial, Elijah stood on the courthouse steps, addressing a crowd of supporters and journalists. "Justice was served today," he said. "But this isn't the end. It's a reminder that we must remain vigilant, that we must continue to fight against the forces of hate and division." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Let this be a message to those who think they can silence us. You may try to break us, but we will only rise stronger together." As the crowd erupted into cheers, Elijah stepped down, shaking hands with community leaders and embracing those who had supported him throughout his ordeal. In that moment, Elijah knew that while the road ahead would still be difficult, it was a road worth traveling. His attackers had sought to silence him, but instead they had amplified his voice and strengthened his resolve. This was more than justice. It was a new beginning. Months after the trial, Elijah Carter's name had become synonymous with courage and resilience. The scars of that fateful night remained, but they were overshadowed by the impact his stand had created. Across the nation, his story inspired a wave of grassroots movements aimed at combating hate and fostering unity. In Millhaven, Elijah's leadership extended beyond the courtroom. He partnered with local organizations to create initiatives that brought diverse communities together. One such project was the Bridge to Justice program, which offered free legal aid to marginalized groups, ensuring that justice was accessible to all, not just the privileged. During one of the program's community events, Elijah sat under a white tent, speaking with residents about their struggles. An elderly woman with weathered hands approached him, holding a basket of homemade biscuits. "Judge Carter," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "you don't know what it means to us to see someone like you stand so tall. You've given us hope." Elijah took her hand gently, his expression warm. "Hope is something we build together," he said. "I'm just doing my part." The woman smiled, tears glistening in her eyes, and walked away as another community member approached. Meanwhile, the effects of Elijah's story rippled far beyond Millhaven. School curriculums began incorporating discussions about systemic racism and the importance of standing against hate. Universities invited Elijah to speak, and his lectures were packed with students eager to hear his insights on justice, courage, and the power of resilience. One such lecture was held at a prestigious university in New York. The packed auditorium was silent as Elijah shared his journey, his voice measured but powerful. "Hate thrives in silence," he said, looking out at the sea of faces. "But so does hope. When we choose to speak up, to act, and to hold one another accountable, we starve hate of its power. That's what I learned when I stood in the face of hatred." After the lecture, a young woman approached him, her voice trembling with emotion. "Judge Carter, I grew up in a community where people like me were always told we didn't belong. Hearing your story made me believe I could be more. Thank you." Elijah smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You belong. Never let anyone tell you otherwise," he replied, shaking her hand firmly. Back in Millhaven, Elijah's personal life was also transforming. He reconnected with his younger brother David, who had been estranged from him for years. The attack had served as a stark reminder of the fragility of life, and both brothers made an effort to bridge the gap between them. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner at Elijah's home, David raised a glass of wine. "To you, big brother," he said, "for never giving up, even when the world tried to break you." Elijah chuckled softly, clinking his glass with David's. "And to us," he said, "for finding our way back to each other." The moment was simple yet profound, a testament to the power of reconciliation and family. The ultimate recognition of Elijah's efforts came 1 year after the attack. At a televised ceremony, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his unwavering commitment to justice and equality. Standing on the stage, Elijah addressed the nation once more. "This medal is not just for me," he began, his voice steady and filled with gratitude. "It's for every person who has ever faced injustice and refused to back down. It's for every community that has chosen unity over division. And it's a reminder that courage is contagious. When we stand together, we are unstoppable." The audience erupted into applause, and Elijah's family, seated in the front row, watched with pride. Among them was Marcus, the young man who had written Elijah the heartfelt poem. He had become an intern in Elijah's office, pursuing his dream of becoming a civil rights lawyer. As Elijah stepped off the stage, he was greeted by reporters eager for a soundbite. But instead of rushing to the cameras, he turned to Marcus and said, "You ready to make your mark?" Marcus grinned. "I've got a lot to learn, but I'm ready." As the years passed, Elijah's influence continued to grow, but he never lost sight of the mission that had begun in the parking lot of that courthouse. He often reflected on that night, not with bitterness but with a sense of purpose. "Hate tried to silence me," he would tell audiences, "but it only made my voice louder." And louder it grew, echoing across the nation, a beacon for those who believed in justice, hope, and the unyielding power of resilience.